Well, good morning, everyone. We are absolutely thrilled to tell you about one of the most fascinating areas of applying blockchain technology. I'm Heather Flannery. I lead healthcare and life sciences for an organization called Consensus. That's with a Y. I also lead a standards development working group for IEEE at the intersection of blockchain and healthcare and life sciences, and co-chair the blockchain task force at an organization called HIMSS. Thrilled to be here and really honored to have two very esteemed leaders from the pharmaceutical industry here to unpack this incredible subject. Let's begin with you, Ken.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Ken Nessel, and I work for Pfizer, the global pharmaceutical company. There, I'm the senior director and lead of a team called Blockchain Strategy and Execution. That is, in effect, a blockchain center of excellence for Pfizer. So my role is to help catalyze our effective use of blockchain by first developing a deep understanding of the technology itself, as well as identifying the highest value use cases, and then providing technical leadership to our blockchain projects. I've always seen my role as being part offense and part defense. Offense in the sense that there are real opportunities that we see with blockchain, and we want to pursue those opportunities aggressively. But also defense in that not all blockchain use cases are good blockchain use cases, and we want to sort of steer away. My role is to help try to steer away from those and towards the higher potential opportunities that are out there. In terms of a personal background, I've worked in life sciences for about 20 years and held a variety of different roles in different business lines, including commercial, R&D, and medical. And most recently, prior to my blockchain role, I was leading the Solutions Center for the R&D business line. So that's what gave me a lot of sort of foundation for our conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. And Dr. Goffman.
Hi, so I'm Kate Goffman. I work for AstraZeneca currently. I'm a cardiologist and intensive cardiologist by training. I have a doctorate degree in cardiology and epidemiology. And I worked in life sciences probably over 20 years now, yeah. And I've done all kinds of things there in clinical research and changed roles from basically data management to managing clinical site to building a CRO. And now I work on the sponsor side. And it kind of gave me really good in-depth knowledge of how things are done in this area of clinical trials that we're going to discuss today. And really, when we started looking at blockchain at AstraZeneca for about a few years ago, there were only a few of us really kind of seeing that opportunity and being engaged with it. And now the number of people grew dramatically, which really good to see. And right now we're in the process of putting together a few very interesting projects, which I'm a part of, and we're happy to talk about it.
Thank you, Dr. Goffman. As we go through this dialogue, we know we have a mixed audience, so we're going to try to define our acronyms as we go. So CRO is a contract research organization. So a little bit about the context of this industry. I think it would be super helpful if we had each of you describe and summarize the role of Pfizer and AstraZeneca, respectively, in the global pharmaceutical industry. Ken?
So Pfizer is a global pharmaceutical company. We are based here in sunny, warm New York City. At least it used to be occasionally. But we have offices in about 125 countries around the world. Our medicines and vaccines are taken by about 780 million people, and we invest every year about $8 billion in R&D in support of our mission to try to create breakthroughs that change patients' lives.
Yeah, and well, similarly, AstraZeneca is a big global pharmaceutical company that was created in 1998 by the merger of Astra and Zeneca. Astra was a Swedish part, Zeneca was British part. Our drugs are pretty well known, something like Crestor, Pulmicort, Nexium, maybe you know. So this is all the production of AstraZeneca, and we have offices pretty much in the same areas as you guys do, and I think we have around 60,000 employees around the world.
But we make Viagra, so just.
I know. You can't
drop the mic.
Yes.
You can't argue with that. No.
And no, I have no samples on it, or none that I'm willing to share. So just get that out of the way.
You can't.
Great to know.
You can't beat
Great to know. You won't be accosted in the hallway.
Good.
So when we talk about blockchain for clinical trials, for folks outside the healthcare and life sciences industry, you might hear that and think that's a single use case, when in fact it is a wide spectrum of maybe many dozens of individual use cases. And Dr. Goffman, it would be great if you could start out by unpacking for the audience the major phases of clinical trials and connecting them just at a high level to the different opportunities to use blockchain and tokenization in that wide arc.
Yeah. Okay, so clinical trial, and people hear about that all the time, is actually a research program that is run with the participation of humans. So that's why it's called clinical. When we look at the clinical trials, really, it's kind of, you kind of have to look at phases of development. And because of the complexity of the human biology and the drugs that we're developing, we expose humans to drugs, you know, in a progressive order. So you start with phase 1, which is a very limited phase where you just expose maybe about 50 to 60 people to a drug. Then when you are sure that the drug more or less is doing what it should be doing to the body and the body does to the drug what it should be doing, you expose a little bit more people. So it's phase 2. And then it kind of progresses towards, you know, enrolling, depending on the program, about, you know, 5,000 to 10,000 people. And if you're successful with this, which, you know, happens in 5% of cases, more or less, because 95% of the, you know, drugs in clinical trials fail, actually, you get to go for an approval, and you get to talk to multiple regulators around the world who will look at the data that you've collected and make sure that all the regulatory requirements, which is like multiple, it's humongous complexity, if you're meeting them, then you get to put the drug on the market. And whenever you set up a clinical trial, there's certain, like, 3 phases. It starts with feasibility and a start of the trial, and that's like a huge undertake because you have to find people who will be enrolling patients. Those are investigators in hospitals at the sites that are working directly with patients. To do that, you would hire a contract research organization, more or less, usually, unless you have some capability in-house. And they would manage your relationships with the investigators who are managing relationships with patients. And then, you know, in between, there will be multiple people who will be collecting the data, curating the data that will go in effect into the drug into this submission of the drug package that will be viewed as a substantiation of your claim to put it on the market. So there's like a lot of handovers there. And then the next phase is that when you run the trial, and that requires a lot of operational capabilities because you have to collect samples, you have to collect the data, you have to send the samples, you have to send the drug to the site so that, you know, site can get that drug to the patient. And when the program is over and actually you are able to follow up on all those patients, you'll go to the study closeout, and that will require you to clean the data and give it to the sponsor like AstraZeneca and Pfizer to look at it and write up their results. So that's kind of like the bottom line. And the idea is that because there's so many intermediaries in the process, and the process is so complex and expensive and prone to failure at any stage, because everything is a human factor, starting from the patient going into whoever designed the experiment, who is running it, who is analyzing it, who is writing it up. You know, there's a huge opportunity for blockchain in my mind.
Thank you, Dr. Goffman. And I know we've talked a lot about multiple stakeholders here, and maybe, Ken, you could give a little bit more detail in the way that these stakeholders currently interact and where this novel set of technologies could change that paradigm.
Yeah, if we just take the description, Kate, that you provided and just put like a blockchain lens on it and see what we have here. So we've got, multiple parties, independent parties. You've got the manufacturers like our companies, you've got CROs, you've got clinical sites, you've got analytic labs, right? All those independent parties need to transact and share data and do it securely. And there's sort of an innate sort of lack of trust, let's say, between the parties, because all parties need to ultimately sort of demonstrate that they've met the requirements of this clinical protocol. And so there's sort of a need to monitor each other and sort of mutually verify in that sense. And then from all of that comes a lot of operational friction, basically. And just to sort of, clinical trials are known for being a few things, for being difficult to administer, being costly and time consuming. And just to take that and put it behind like a very specific example, one of the use cases that we've evaluated is which I think is pretty easy to understand regardless of your exposure to clinical trials, is biospecimen tracking. In the course of conducting a clinical trial, biospecimens are collected from study subjects. This might be blood or a tumor sample. And then that happens at a third party at a clinical site. Then that sample is sent on to a central lab, who's also a third party. They then send it on to an analytic lab who's specialized to provide certain analysis of that. And here's where it gets really tricky. That lab may then subdivide that sample now into multiple samples and send those on to other labs for other specialized testing. So you've got a really complicated sort of track and trace problem here, and it's not just about where's the sample, but it's about what was done with the sample, what tests were run with it. And basically the study can't be closed out until you verified that what's happened with that sample is what was dictated to happen by the study protocol. So since all those different parties that are involved in that tracking and tracing are independent and different and have their different tracking systems, at the end of the trial we have to go chase, and figure out where was that when we don't have the right documentation, let's get the right documentation. And all of that is delaying study closeout, which is delaying getting new therapies to patients. So it's a significant impact. And if you put blockchain against something like that, you could start seeing how you could create a shared infrastructure for that tracking of that biospecimen in a way that's mutually verifiable, as well as can be used to demonstrate compliance to auditors or regulators about what happened with that sample. You could also program some of the protocol right into the smart contracts so that the right tests get run by the right parties in the right spots. It could really bring a lot of efficiency and so do away with a lot of the retrospective reconciliation that happens today and make it all more sort of real time in the course of the trial.
And that mention of real time gets to this potential of real time analytics. And one characteristic of the cadence of clinical trials is that data is normalized and analyzed and reported out to different stakeholders infrequently if you're looking at real time as the alternative. Dr. Goffman, could you comment a little bit about the difficulty in data integrity in clinical trials and maintaining data integrity, especially in large multi-site or scenarios, and what a CTMS is a clinical trials management system, what using blockchain in the context of clinical trials management might achieve with data integrity?
Well, yeah, I'll just give you an example around the patient-informed consent. So patient-informed consent, meaning that patients are providing their consent, they're consenting to participating in a clinical trial, knowing all the risks and potential benefits, is like a cornerstone of the clinical research. This is something that is preserving the human right, the patient right within the clinical program. And so whenever you, let's say, are subject to an audit, God save you from the FDA audit or AMA audit, but any kind of an internal audit, the first thing that people look at whether the informed consent process was done correctly. And by doing it correctly, you have to make sure that the patient actually understood the study, that they were able to ask all possible questions, that they were able to get the answers to those questions, and then they really had time to consider whether this is something that they want to do. And they did it voluntarily, so nobody, affected their decision. And so when you do it on site, and as an investigator, let's say, and as a clinical site monitor in the past, what you do, it used to be like we would have, paper forms, we would give them to the patient, and the patient would have to sign each page, and it's still like that. And then you have to make sure that if you make a mistake, God save you from that, on that form, you have to go through like a rigorous process of scratching it, striking it out, putting your signature, putting the date, the time, when, how you made that correction on the informed consent. And all of that is a very complex procedure. And then you have to store this form for about 20 years on site, preferably in a storage facility that will not break, will not flood, will not burn. You have to have a key to that facility. That key has to be stored appropriately with a specific, it just goes on and on and on, And so obviously this kind of like really limits recruitment of patients, if you can imagine, especially, those patients who have difficulties getting to the site, who have difficulties, mental, impairment, potentially physical impairment. And so what we've done, and what one of the cases that is being investigated is how can you do actually remotely and ensure that, all those things that go into informed consent are actually preserved. And so blockchain really allows you to document every step of the way, like every metadata piece that, potentially could serve as an audit trail for an FDA or EMA, showing you that, you go through steps that actually a patient was able to interact with the physician remotely, they asked questions, the questions were returned, and so on and so forth. So this is like one of those examples where data integrity is essential.
If I can add to that, I think one other, just a few sort of metrics which are sort of useful to consider in this sort of, use case around patient recruitment is that, it takes a long time and is typically not done very well.
Yeah.
I think it's 84% of clinical trials fail to actually recruit patients in the amount of time that is their goal. And the process of recruiting patients for a clinical trial is so cumbersome, it's like 1/3 of the trial time is spent just in the recruitment process.
Well, I remember I was setting up a site in Ukraine where there was literally nothing. It was like, just a village in Ukraine, but it had like the patient population that we were going to. And and we had to train people in that hospital to do clinical research. I spent the months living there explaining to them what needs to be done and how things were documented. And people couldn't understand, like, why am I asking them to do that? It was interesting. But we went for that patient population because we needed it.
From the patient experience side of the same metrics, if you have a rare disease or you receive a cancer diagnosis or maybe you have an unusual genetic condition or a highly prevalent disease, it's very unlikely that you, the patient, would ever be made aware of an opportunity to participate in a clinical trial. Highly unlikely. So not only are the pharmaceutical manufacturers unduly burdened, essentially because all of your EHR data is not correct and curated or accessible for trials matching, but also you, the patient, have no mechanism to be made aware of research opportunities. And those are just a couple of examples of really massive systemic challenges that cause this cycle from bench to bedside. Bench refers to bench research or basic research, all the way to commercialization of a new intervention or therapeutic. 17 to 25 years is often talked about, and it's not because it takes that long to actually answer the research questions.
Well, depends. If you want to do an observation, you probably need a few years. You may need a few years, but
But many of us feel we can compress that window down substantially with this technology.
Absolutely, yeah.
So there's no doubt that there's a huge amount of potential, and there's an awful lot of hype in our space. The technology is maturing quickly, but we don't have a lot outside of the supply chain arena. We don't have a lot that's happening and in production right now. I'd love to talk a little bit about why that is. What are we up against as an industry in healthcare and life sciences, and what are we going to have to do to overcome these barriers? Maybe we could start with you, Ken. What's your honest assessment of where we are today and what's holding us back?
Yeah, I feel like there's a popular perception that the rate limiting factor in actual blockchain adoption has something to do with the technology itself, that the technology isn't scalable, it's not fast enough, that the developer tools aren't in place. But my experience is that's really not the rate limiting factor at this point. It's not even at the top of my list. I think the technology is basically good enough to have more production blockchains than we have today. The rate limiting factor is that blockchain is a shared infrastructure, and when you have shared infrastructure, you need shared governance, and shared governance is hard. Typically, to implement a blockchain, you need a business network, and who's going to be in that business network? Probably your competitors, and you're going to need to reach agreement on some critical things about who's a member of the network, what's the commercial model behind the network, what legal form does it take. And how do you manage that network and that software over time? And that's hard work. Like if you can do that, you should go negotiate Brexit or NAFTA, because you're at that level of international negotiation expertise or something like that. So it's hard work. I mean, it's going to happen. Progress is being made, but it doesn't happen fast. It takes a lot of back and forth to kind of get the right mix of motivations and incentives and the right people at the table to really make it happen. So I think that's what's making it slow.
Could you build on that just a little bit around everything you just said, but now across multiple jurisdictions? Both Pfizer and AstraZeneca are working in every jurisdiction around the world, and the compliance burden and the reg tech dimension of all of this is both an opportunity, but also really difficult to build infrastructures that need to be reused. You can't build one of these infrastructures in every country where you do business, so they have to span jurisdictional boundaries generally. Some thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is a complicating factor, for sure. The privacy requirements are different in different parts of the world. In Europe, there's GDPR, and in the U.S., there's HIPAA. So you've got a lot of different obligations that need to be met. And yet, a lot of the processes in our global companies are actually global. So you've got to sort of think about how you see these things. Is it in fact a global network, or is it something that's more regional? Supply chains tend to be more regional. There's some fundamental differences in the way supply chains work in the U.S. versus other parts of the world. I think clinical trial processes tend to be more global. We run a lot of global trials, so that makes sense. But just sort of back to my governance point, what you also see is now a proliferation of these different business networks forming in different parts of the world. Kate and I and AstraZeneca and Pfizer are on one in Europe under the IMI initiative. There are other ones in the US, and that too is sort of a complicating factor, is that you've got sort of competing governance initiatives, and everybody has the FOMO, fear of missing out. They don't want to miss something, but we can't participate in all of them because these initiatives tend to call on the same group of people in terms of their expertise, and participating in all of them probably means that you'll make none of them successful. So you have to sort of pick and choose, which is hard to do in an emerging technology space.
And these shared infrastructures, you're talking about shared strategic planning, shared IT operations, shared risk management. Who writes the insurance policy to underwrite these infrastructures? How is the capital pooled and formed? And it's very much, I agree with you completely that these are much more foundational business challenges than they are technical challenges. But we do have a number of barriers that live in the technical area. And I know, Dr. Goffman, you've been exposed to some of those. What do you think we need to overcome, maybe at the data layer to be able to see these infrastructures actually achieve the data liquidity that is their potential?
Well, I kind of agree with what Ken said around the processes, because global processes are very complicated in big companies, especially when you have to adhere to all kinds of regulations. But to your point, when we have to have a shared infrastructure, we do share infrastructure in a way, and I'll give you an example. So I work in safety. That's sort of like a public health interest type of function, where we are supposed to collect the data about all kinds of adverse events that happen to our drugs, and then make sure that we surveil it, understand the scope of it, and if we see the risk, we manage the risk and communicate it appropriately where it needs to be communicated. And it's very kind of simplistic explanation. And sometimes we co-develop drugs with Pfizer, with, other big pharmaceutical companies. And sometimes those agreements that actually require you to share the data in between companies are so complex that you have to have a, specific IT infrastructure to make sure that this data exchange is possible. And, one of the hurdles, I think, is that, companies constantly try to innovate. The innovation is really slow. The reason for that is because, we've just set up a process, we've just set up an infrastructure that can adhere to all those multiple global regulations, just invested all that money. And so now we have a new tack. So how do we actually utilize it? So how do you write, let's say right now we're trying to compare how we would exchange safety data on blockchain with multiple stakeholders versus sending it back and forth through gateways and specific IT infrastructures that use, postulated by regulators data model. So what how do you write the data to blockchain? How do you set up that process? And more importantly, is this going to be beneficial really to what, in comparison to what you have now? And those are like the hurdles, because you kind of have to pass through the major hype when people say, oh, everything's possible in blockchain. Well, yeah, a lot of things are possible, but what exactly you want to do with it and how exactly, you want to write the data and what data model are you using. So these are the challenges that I'm facing actually right now.
Following on that point, on the subject of adverse events, it would be helpful to have a little bit of an understanding of all the fuzziness that happens around what's necessary to actually capture that something has occurred in the healthcare delivery environment. How that gets reported today or doesn't, how it gets rolled up and flows ultimately into your role at AstraZeneca, for example, and to the regulators. Those are the way that things are identified are today imperfect, and that's in part because there's very little, if any, connectivity between the healthcare delivery environment and what's happening with pharmacovigilance and the regulatory environment. Could you just speak to that very quickly?
Yeah, so we, as pharma depends on the volunteer reporting of adverse events, because when the drug goes to the market, you only have so much data. You can't test it on a wide population, then it goes live. And so you receive the data from more or less, usually from medical professionals, but now, the culture is changing. So you get more and more events reported by patients or their relatives, and that comes to us from different channels, maybe from websites. Sometimes people call our hotline, sometimes they send information to their local regulator, and that kind of it's just a very complex system how you collect that data. Then once you manage to collect it, you kind of have to follow up on that. And if something really bad happens, you have to call and reach those people and find them. But if we had a way, and then if you have 5 people co-owning a drug in different parts of the world, you have to exchange with them, and you have to do it in a timely fashion, and it's just really, really complex. But once you've collected it, usually you're dealing with the partial data where you don't really know what happened. Sometimes you don't even know if it's your drug, because if it went off patent, then you have to, they report key ingredient to you. So you don't know if it's your drug or somebody else's drug, but you have to deal with it and analyze it and make sense out of it. And it's really not perfect.
There's a question here. So, Kate, do you think there's a possibility, instead of each of our companies building its own infrastructure to do adverse event monitoring and reporting, to create an industry utility to do that, since we're essentially providing the same service, doing the same analysis, but we're doing it company by company?
Yeah, well, the whole point of blockchain is that you have to participate. You can't set up a blockchain. Well, I guess you can set up a semi-blockchain within, internally and call it blockchain. But yeah, if we had this type of technology being more and more widely accepted by regulators, by other sponsors, by people who actually produce the data, like hospitals or clinical sites, we could have a just complete different data life cycle that could be much healthier and much more effective.
Mm-hmm.
I think that really gets to a key idea of the role of patient-mediated data exchange, aggregation, and curation to support the whole wide arc of clinical research and real-world evidence, all the way to value-based agreements. So we're almost at time. So I'd like to invite each of you to make a closing remark if there's a single important idea. I know for me, I'd like everyone to understand that as patients and caregivers, you will have a role to participate in the transformation of this industry. And please keep your eye out for deployments and things that you can, as a healthcare consumer, participate in. Dr. Goffman, closing remark?
Closing remark. Okay. Well, I think that this whole area of life science is very complex because it's so diverse. But you know, complexity usually leads to a lot of opportunity. And if you want to see the opportunity for blockchain, you should look at life sciences, because there's just so much ways you can improve. You have to start small, though. You can't, you know, resolve all the world problems in one day, which is what we're doing. But the opportunity is there, and I just would encourage everybody to look into that.
Thanks, Dr. Goffman. And Ken?
Yeah, I think for my part, you know, assuming that the audience here is perhaps in a similar role, evaluating use cases within your own companies. One thing that sort of has evolved about my thinking is, like, when we sort of started looking at blockchain, I was like looking for that home run, like, blockchain use case, the one that's going to have such a huge impact. It's gonna, you know, ticker tape parade in your honor, you know. But you know, I've evolved from thinking about it differently to thinking about it more as like a successive sort of a series of base hits that still get you around the bases, but it's not going to be sort of one move that does that. Because blockchain is essentially around, you know, about decentralized record keeping, and many of our processes are not truly decentralized, they're more distributed. So to get to something that's decentralized typically requires a number, you know, of steps. And so I think a lot about, you know, use cases from a use case adjacency perspective. Like, if this use case is adjacent to this other one, which is adjacent to this other one, it gives you like a ladder, a way to grow and build the impact, you know, over time, which is probably the way that we're going to have to get there, versus trying to, you know, swallow the elephant in one go.
Yeah. Well, excellent points. So please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists.